Hello, my name is Nicholas Furnival. You're watching an OSW interview. Today I'll be talking to Dr Maria Domańska, an expert from OSW's Russian department. In our previous interview, which you can still find online, we discussed the geopolitical causes of Russia's war in Ukraine. Today we'll be investigating the domestic causes for that war and asking what impact it may have on Russia's domestic scene in future. So, Maria, hello.
Hello.
So we want to focus more on the domestic causes of the war today. My first question is, how much pressure does Putin have from public opinion?
Actually, there is no tangible pressure from the public opinion, and there's quite few people who dared to protest against the war. Very few people among the elite, very few people in the society. But if we're talking about the public at large, it seems to be quite fully controlled by the Kremlin, by the state propaganda. The main reason for that is that people don't see much sense in protesting because they see growing repression. They see that there is no real opposition or civil society strong enough to be able to create some kind of counterbalance vis-a-vis the authorities. So people try either to emigrate or distance themselves from the topic of war and just focus on their everyday lives and sort of wait out this whole situation, which is perceived as highly unfavorable for everyone, roughly, but still they don't see much sense in doing anything about it because they know that they can face serious repression for the slightest expression of protest or criticism of the Kremlin.
Okay, so you mentioned the elites as well. So is there pressure from within the elite? Are there people who can influence Putin?
The elite seems to be totally suppressed and subordinated. And last year, even before the start of the war, 2 days before the invasion, the full-scale invasion, we saw a spectacle during the Security Council meeting when Putin ostentatiously showed to everyone that they must keep silent and just obey the orders because there is no room anymore for any pluralism of opinions. And he quite rudely disciplined those participants of that meeting who tried to somehow find nuances and in the discussion. So at that moment, the discussion, of course, was not about the war because the decision to invade Ukraine seemed to surprise almost everyone among the elite. At that moment, the discussion was about the recognition of independence of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk republics. But, for example, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service didn't seem to fit into Putin's desired narratives. And one of two other people also tried to persuade Putin to continue for at least some time in negotiations with the West. But at that moment, it was sort of a neo-Stalinist spectacle, a show aiming at disciplining the elite. Although Russia has been an autocracy for many years already, before the war, some kind of pluralism within the elite had been tolerated. But at that moment, it was demonstrated 100% that all elite members have to follow Putin, even if he takes very controversial decisions without consulting the majority of the official state leadership, in fact.
But you would state that there was domestic pressure for the war for the invasion of Ukraine.
Well, I would say that it wasn't like someone pressured Putin to start it. It was rather his own understanding of the situation. And I would say that he started this full-scale invasion sort of preemptively. I mean, he started the invasion to prevent possible contagion of Russian society with a very bad, in quotation marks, a very bad Ukrainian example. Because it was
The color revolution.
a color revolution, but it was even more. I mean, Ukraine was on a path with tighter integration with the EU, and there was an emerging strong Ukrainian identity after 2014, after the first phase of invasion, Russian invasion. And it was quite clear that Ukraine is more and more distancing itself from Russia. This full-scale invasion was kind of forward defense against further diffusion of Western values, liberal democratic values. I think that Putin realized that if Ukraine succeeds on this path, this example may be contagious for Russians. And he is really obsessed with this idea of color revolution. And it started in 2011. There were mass protests in Russia then, mainly in Moscow, against Putin returning to the presidency. And also he very well remembers the situation in Libya and the way how Gaddafi died. And I think it made huge impression on him. So since then, he has been tightening the screws for many years to prevent any kind of destabilisation in Russia. This full-scale invasion was a kind of forward defense and preemptive action against the diffusion of liberal democratic values, and against and when Putin says that the West is the enemy of Russia. It's not about what the West does or says. It's about what the West is. Putin's strategic goal, I would say, is to unravel the EU and NATO as institutional pillars of this Western liberal democratic community, which is based on common values and interests. And he's really scared of possible diffusion of this Western, let's say, civilization, but Western values also, beyond the current borders of the Western, the transatlantic community, let's say.
What you mentioned about Gaddafi's death haunting Putin, it would seem from the outside that the Ukraine war made this scenario more realistic for Russia. Didn't Putin see any alternatives to preemptively stopping the potential color revolution in Russia? For example, reforms?
Well, he apparently didn't. Reforms is something absolutely beyond any discussion in Russia. Reforms would mean for him opening the window for destabilization, and he perceives possible reforms as a threat to his autocratic power. So, no, he didn't see an alternative. He decided to start this full-scale war. But he was terribly mistaken in his assessments of the situation, because he did expect the Russian army to capture Kyiv within 3 days. And he really counted on some kind of occupation of the larger part of Ukraine, at least. This was sort of, for him, I think, it was sort of a last warning call towards the West to stop meddling into Russia's privileged sphere of influence in the so-called post-Soviet area. The problem is also that Putin and many people in Russia actually perceive these regions that used to be part of the Soviet Union as still a post-Soviet area, ignoring totally all the differences that emerged over decades since the Soviet Union collapsed. For them, it's just a homogeneous territory that should be under Russian control in one way or another.
In one way or another, okay. I wanted to move on to a subject we touched on last time, which is the potential Ukrainian victory, which could lead to a sequence of events. Putin loses power. What happens to Russia? And many people have predicted the demise of Russia, the collapse of Russia, but in what way could that happen? So I would like to ask you about, say, the Union state. Could that break up? And perhaps some of the ethnic minorities in Russia, could they seek independence or greater independence within a federal Russia?
Well, it's really hard to say. I don't believe in Russia's demise or collapse of the statehood or total disintegration. I would rather say that many people, even in the national republics, I mean the regions populated mainly by ethnic minorities, they still fear the collapse of the state. I mean, the memory of the collapse of the Soviet Union is still quite living. And also in some regions, there is a living memory of the war in Chechnya, of the bloodshed in Chechnya. And this prevents them from thinking about possible independence because they still believe that Moscow would be able to drown in blood also their regions if necessary. Well, we cannot exclude, of course, Russian disintegration in the case when the central authorities, the federal authorities in Moscow, become really weak and unable to control the country. But I would say that something that is more probable is the real federalization. Because now we are dealing with a highly centralized unitary state, which is just called federation. And this state violates the rights of many groups of people, including ethnic minorities. This is not only about the state policies, like suppression of education in national languages or suppressing historical memories that are alternative or competing with the official narrative of the Russian good empire. But it's also about the everyday chauvinism that is unfortunately quite widespread among ethnic Russians. There is, although it is written like in black and white in the constitution that Russia is a multinational or multi-ethnic nation, and although in the official discourse you often hear that Russian authorities care much about developing ethnic and national identities and culture and so on, in fact, the state policies aim to Russify non-ethnic Russians in many ways. At the level of education. Also, there is this prevailing idea, it's sometimes explicit, more often implicit, that Russianness as in the understanding of like state national identity is something identical with ethnic Russianness. So this is really hard to translate because in Russian you have Российский, like national Russian, like Russian passport, for example, Russian citizenry, and Русский, like ethnic Russian. And this is equated.
This ethnic Russian status and the statehood. Okay. Would you say that, say, the ethnic minorities, they feel this difference between their rights as Russian nationals, but not ethnic Russians? Do they feel the linguistic difference? Because it's clear in Russian, but not all of these are, not all of these peoples are native Russian speakers, I believe.
Yeah, definitely. And many people in the region speak local languages, but in the education system is dominated by Russian language. Well, you can have a Russian passport and still feel more Yakut identity, for example, or Karelian identity. But this is highly unwelcome by the Kremlin and by the whole state apparatus. It is very important, for example, for the current state of affairs, that historical memories of non-ethnic Russians about the repression they suffered from the Russian Empire in the past, the Soviet Empire, and now they feel discriminated against by the Russian authorities again. This is something that cannot be legally raised in any public discussion because it is immediately perceived by the state apparatus as a sign of separatist tendencies. So, for example, the discussion intensified about the discrimination after the military mobilization was announced. And it immediately turned out that there is disproportionate percentage of non-ethnic Russians that are forced to join the army.
Is this simple racism that they want to send non-ethnic Russians, or do they find it simply easier on the domestic scene to send these people to war?
It's just easier. It's not a genocidal state policy. It's easier because usually these people live in poorer regions and they are offered quite decent financial compensation for joining the army. But also in many provinces, people are just not very well educated, so they don't fully understand the situation. They fear possible repression. So this is more about poverty, and poverty as a tool of managing the society, I would say. But in the case of some indigenous ethnic groups, that count, for example, several thousand people only. If you take 100 people into the army, it's incredible harm for their future survival, in fact. So I wouldn't say that this is some kind of deliberate policy of destroying ethnic minorities, but the very fact that there is no special policy to avoid such action, it itself leads to possible even extinction of some ethnic groups in the future.
So it's not viewed as this in Moscow, but is it viewed like this in the regions? Are there some ethnic minorities who feel that they are being treated to a genocidal policy?
Yeah, I mean, this is mainly raised by local activists or non-ethnic Russian intelligentsia. It's not a narrative that is widespread among ordinary people. Maybe it's a matter of time because we see some signs of growing frustration among non-ethnic groups. They see that they are disproportionately represented in the army and in the graveyards also. And they don't get enough information sometimes. And when they complain about bad conditions in the army, they are usually not listened to. So it may be a more important topic also among ordinary non-ethnic Russians in the future. We will see, of course.
So it does sound very much like the present-day Russia is just a standard colonial power. Could we look at its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in these terms, that it's just another colonial conquest?
Of course, I would say colonial imperial, because this is tightly intertwined. And Russia is a colonial power. Russia exploits its own regions. Russia gained new territories in the past, not in a peaceful way as is presented by the official discourse, but in a military way by suppressing local populations. This is something that is not present in Russian history textbooks, for example. Even in national republics, students at schools learn history from the textbooks. dominated by the official Russian narrative about a good empire. So it is colonial, and the only difference between Russia and Great Britain or France in the past is that you don't need to sail across the ocean to reach your colonies. Your colonies are inside the state. This is the only difference.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Britain and France, and those empires are no longer with us. It seems like Russia's empire has been around, Russia's colonial conquests are still with it at the moment. And should we await the natural end of this empire too?
Well, it depends on many factors. We cannot, of course, exclude anything. But what seems to me very important is that this topic is over-politicized, both by the Kremlin and in the West. I mean, the Kremlin presents the possible disintegration of Russia. I mean, this bugbear of possible disintegration and collapse of Russian statehood as justification for the growing repression and neo-totalitarian course inside the country. And in the West, many fear of Russia's possible collapse as something that could destabilize the whole region of Eurasia. And of course, there are fears what would happen to Russian nuclear arsenal. Of course, this is something that deserves discussion. But
we did have this discussion 30 years ago, I believe.
We did, and it surprisingly turned out that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was no particular disaster, and the nuclear arsenal was kept under control, and negotiations were fully possible. And I don't see any reason why it should end in a different, more catastrophic way this time. This is not the case that Russians, if the central authorities become weak, I wouldn't say that Russians will immediately start some kind of bloody civil war. Why should they do something like this? But this over-politicization of this question, this fetish of Russia's stability is something that paralyzes the West and prevents the West from working out some more effective strategies vis-a-vis Russia. Because Putin is precisely the person who uses his nuclear arsenal as a tool of blackmail and intimidation towards the West. He is the person who started the regular war and who created the most serious instability in Europe since 1945. And this is under the label of superstability of Russia. So maybe we shouldn't be so much afraid of potential destabilization, because it can open a window of possibility for reforms, for liberalization, for more empowering Russian citizens. And maybe that would be the moment, unseen for decades, when some more positive scenarios could be implemented, and that could be another chance for Russia to maybe start something anew and free itself from this eternal authoritarian path dependence. This is something that is quite ignored in the West as a possibility. This is treated as a bugbear. This is treated as something really bad that we should avoid at any cost. And in fact, we pursued this policy for decades, and it has led us directly towards this full-scale invasion. So superstability is not always the best case scenario, I would say.
Okay, well, I will definitely let you have that as the last word today. Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you for watching this OSW interview. If you enjoyed watching it, please like and subscribe.